How Russia recovered after the collapse of the USSR. At the end of the 20th century, the Russian state, in the form of the USSR, experienced a devastating catastrophe. The repercussions of these events, culminating in the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, continue to impact the fate of our country to this day. The collapse of the country was the result of a series of economic, political, and social processes. However, the historical Russian state existed long before the formation of the USSR. The cultural, economic, and political ties established during those earlier times continue to operate even today. According to the Constitution, the Russian Federation is not only the legal successor of the USSR but also the inheritor of Russian statehood, tracing its lineage from ancient Rus through the Russian Tsardom to the Russian Empire. Over the past 30 years, Russia has traveled a path from destruction to recovery, strengthening, and a new phase of expansion. Economic causes of the collapse. At the turn of the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union, while maintaining external stability, entered a prolonged period of crisis. The economy had nearly exhausted its ability to develop through extensive methods, such as the influx of cheap labor from rural areas. Despite significant investments in its development, agriculture showed extremely low returns. Since 1963, the USSR had been importing grain from abroad, primarily from the United States and Canada, and faced shortages of vegetables, which had to be imported from Bulgaria and Hungary. There was a constant deficit of meat and dairy products. The root cause of this was the inefficiency of the planned economy combined with state ownership, formerly considered national ownership. Although the state spent enormous amounts on improving the technical equipment of agriculture, the increase in capital investments was not matched by an appropriate change in the attitude of farmers towards technology. Ultimately, this led to low efficiency in its use, a lack of care for resources, rapid wear and tear, and wastefulness of material resources. Interestingly, although the USSR produced a vast amount of equipment, repair enterprises constantly faced a shortage of spare parts, which was a flaw inherent in the planned economic system. Starting from the 1960s, Soviet leadership became increasingly captivated by the idea of land reclamation. It was believed that irrigation and soil drainage would yield extraordinary results in agricultural production. Unfortunately, despite the vast sums spent on reclamation, its effectiveness was low, and the investments failed to pay off. Over 20 years, more than 2 billion rubles were invested in developing the region's reclamation industry. However, the investment did not yield the expected results. Production increased by only 159 million rubles, and productivity on irrigated lands rose by just 7%, indicating unsatisfactory use of irrigated land. Even when a considerable harvest was gathered, it had to be preserved and then delivered to the consumer. But the USSR constantly faced problems with preserving and transporting the harvested crops, leading to a significant portion of agricultural products simply spoiling. A similar situation was observed in the production of consumer goods. The mass-produced products in the USSR generally lagged in quality, not only compared to those made in Western Europe, the USA, and Japan, but even to those made in Eastern Europe. The models produced were significantly behind global standards, particularly in automobiles and consumer electronics. Design was a particularly weak point in Soviet products. There were also very serious issues in heavy industry and production efficiency. Although the USSR extracted 8 times more iron ore than the United States and smelted 3 times more pig iron and twice as much steel from the raw material, it produced about the same number of machines as the US. The consumption of raw materials and energy per unit of final product was 1.6 and 2.1 times higher, respectively, than in the United States. The average construction time for an industrial enterprise in the USSR exceeded 10 years, compared to less than 2 years in the US. The Soviet Union produced 16 times more grain harvesters than the US but harvested significantly less grain. Much of this inefficiency was due to extremely low quality and the increasing technological lag. Researchers believe that the Soviet Union was only 20 to 30 years away from a complete halt in economic growth. The economic growth of the USSR from the 1930s to the 1970s was largely driven by two factors. The first was the borrowing of Western technologies during the years of industrialization, when the best foreign design firms, such as Albert Kahn Incorporated, provided the USSR with complete documentation for turnkey factories, along with full specifications of the manufactured products. The next wave of modernization was linked to equipment supplies from Germany as part of post-war reparations. This equipment often continued to operate in Soviet factories until the 1990s. The second factor was the effect of economic mobilization, where the concentration of state efforts on breakthrough areas, space, nuclear industry, military industry, etc., ensured growth, though often at the expense of other sectors, especially consumer goods production. Ideological issues and the national question. The problems faced by the Soviet Union were not limited to the economy. There was also an ideological crisis stemming from the fact that the Marxist-Leninist political doctrine no longer aligned with the interests of the majority of citizens. Central to this doctrine were concepts like the Soviet people, the merging of the various peoples of the USSR into a new collective identity, the rejection of private property, with public ownership, effectively state ownership, as the only recognized form of property, a one-party political system with the ruling party exercising control over all aspects of state and societal life, the rejection of a market economy in favor of an administrative command system, and total control over ideology. The rise to power of a new generation of Soviet nomenklatura, individuals who had been educated and shaped within the Soviet state, such as Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, and Mikhail Sislov, among others, in the mid-1960s did not bring about changes in the country's ideology. The political elite continued to promote ideas from the early days of the Soviet state. Any attempts to step outside the boundaries of communist ideology, or even to modernize it to meet contemporary demands, were categorically forbidden. A problem that the USSR was utterly unable to address was the national question, which was forced underground and banned from public discourse. The Soviet Union was initially structured in such a way that the more privileged national republics exploited the Russian core, drawing subsidies from the USSR budget. A striking example of this disparity can be seen in the differences in turnover tax and income tax contributions to the Union budget. In 1975, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, was allowed to retain 42.3% of the turnover tax collected in its territory, while Ukraine kept 43.3%, Latvia 45.6%, Moldova 50%, Estonia 59.7%, Belarus 68.2%, Azerbaijan 69.1%, Georgia 88.5%, Armenia 89.9%, Tajikistan 99.1%, Kyrgyzstan 93.2%, Lithuania 99.7%, Uzbekistan 99.8%, Kazakhstan 100%, and Turkmenistan 100%. In such conditions of economic disparity, the demographic landscape changed significantly during the last 30 years of the USSR's existence. The population of Tajiks increased by 200%, Uzbeks by 176%, Azerbaijanis by 150%, Kazakhs and Kyrgyz by 125%, Armenians, Georgians, and Moldovans by 60%. In contrast, the Slavic peoples were in a far less advantageous position, with the number of Belarusians increasing by 26%, Ukrainians by 18%, and Russians by 27%. The Soviet Union's policy of resolutely combating nationalism was applied only to the Russian majority. At the same time, nationalist ideas found influence and support in the national peripheries, where much of the local cultural and scientific elites were overtly nationalist in their orientation. This became glaringly evident during Perestroika, when it was precisely the national intelligentsia of the Soviet republics that led the local movements for secession from the USSR. Perestroika and the beginning of the USSR's dissolution. Lacking a solid economic foundation and burdened with a stagnant ideology and mounting national contradictions, the Soviet Union was unable to sustain its development. The state's collapse occurred amid an attempt by the Soviet leadership, headed by General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU, Mikhail Gorbachev, to modernize the economy and liberalize political life. Once strict ideological control was weakened and Marxist ideology collapsed, the USSR lost its final unifying elements and began to disintegrate. The Soviet republics sought to break free from the control of the center. This desire was shared by the ruling elites of the national republics, who sought to transform their positions into real power and wealth, as well as by the national intelligentsia, who aspired to establish nationally oriented regimes in the republics. The state sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR, was declared on June 12, 1990. The decision was driven by the power struggle between the chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the RSFSR, Boris Yeltsin, and the then president of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev attempted to undermine Yeltsin by initiating the passage of the law on the delimitation of powers between the USSR and the subjects of the Federation on April 26, 1990. This legal act equalized the status of autonomous republics, within the RSFSR, with that of the Union republics. To clarify the administrative structure of the Soviet Union, in addition to the 15 Soviet Socialist Republics, SSRs, many of these republics, primarily within the RSFSR, contained autonomous republics, ASSRs, which were regions of a second level. Gorbachev's initiative placed both types of republics on an equal footing. Such a law was understandably perceived by the Russian leadership as a threat to the territorial integrity of Russia, as it effectively made the 16 autonomous regions independent of the RSFSR. Furthermore, Yeltsin's role and that of the RSFSR leadership were minimized since the autonomous republics could now deal directly with the Central Soviet government, bypassing the RSFSR authorities. This development sparked discussions about a renewed union, which by the following year, 1991, led to concrete decisions within the framework of the Novoagaryovo process. This process aimed to reconstitute the USSR, with all Russian autonomies entering the Union on equal terms and with equal rights. In response, the Declaration of Sovereignty of the RSFSR was issued. This political move marked a shift in initiative to Yeltsin, leaving Gorbachev without the support of the largest Soviet republic. As a result, Gorbachev was forced to navigate between the interests of other Soviet republics, offering them increasingly more rights and privileges. This period marked the beginning of the Parade of Sovereignties, with Soviet republics one after another declaring their independence from the Central Soviet government, with the expectation that full state independence would follow. The USSR began its transformation into a confederation. However, this process never reached completion, becoming a brief transitional period from declarations of sovereignty to the eventual dissolution of the USSR. From August 18 to 21, 1991, members of Gorbachev's inner circle, Gennady Yanayev, Valentin Pavlov, Anatoly Lukyanov, and others, attempted to isolate him at his dacha in Crimea and announced the introduction of a state of emergency. They organized what became known as the State Committee on the State of Emergency, GKCHP. However, by that time, the crisis in the USSR had progressed so far that hundreds of thousands of Moscow residents and people from other cities took to the streets in opposition to the GKCHP. The leadership of the RSFSR, headed by Yeltsin, also opposed the coup. Barricades were erected around the Supreme Soviet building of the RSFSR, and the Soviet army began to side with the Russian authorities. The August coup ended with Gorbachev's return to the capital, but real power had shifted into Yeltsin's hands. The weakness of Gorbachev's post-coup position led to increased assertiveness among the Soviet republics. Negotiations between the RSFSR, the Ukrainian SSR, and the Belarusian SSR culminated in the leaders of the three republics signing the Belavaza Accords on December 8, 1991. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, as the countries that had signed the 1922 treaty forming the USSR, declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. To coordinate the former Soviet republics and ensure stability during the transition period, a supranational entity known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, was created. President Gorbachev chose not to attempt to retain power and agreed to this decision. At 7:35 p.m. on December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union's state flag was lowered from the Senate building in the Kremlin, and 10 minutes later, the flag of the Russian Federation was raised in its place. Historical Russia, which had existed in the form of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, had dissolved. The Parade of Sovereignties. However, the declaration of sovereignty of the RSFSR had consequences not just for the USSR. Article 9 of this document stated, "The Congress of People's Deputies of the RSFSR affirms the need for a significant expansion of the rights of autonomous republics, autonomous regions, autonomous districts, as well as territories and regions of the RSFSR." This meant that the Parade of Sovereignties could and should now extend to the next level, the autonomous republics and other national entities within the RSFSR. The elites of these autonomous republics and the national intelligentsia looked enviously at the Soviet republics and wanted to follow their example. The beginning of this second Parade of Sovereignties was marked by a speech Yeltsin delivered on August 6, 1990, in Kazan. "Take as much sovereignty as you can swallow," he declared. Although Yeltsin's statement nearly led to the collapse of our statehood, it may have been the lesser evil under the circumstances. By promising sovereignty within Russia, Yeltsin secured the support of the RSFSR's autonomous republics, which otherwise might have backed Gorbachev, whose plans threatened to destroy Russia as it exists today. Had the renewed union been established, all of Russia's national entities, having gained the status of union republics, would have automatically ceased to be part of Russia. After Yeltsin's speech on sovereignty, declarations quickly followed from all major national republics and autonomous regions. The Karelian ASSR, August 9, 1990, just 3 days after Yeltsin's speech in Kazan; the Tatar ASSR, August 31, 1990, the Udmurt and Yakutsk ASSR, September 27, 1990, the Chukotka Autonomous Okrug, the Adinghi Autonomous Oblast, October 5, 1990, the Buryat ASSR, October 7, 1990, the Bashkir ASSR, October 11, 1990, the Komi ASSR, October 11, 1990, the Kalmyk ASSR, October 19, 1990, the Mari ASSR, October 22, 1990, the Chuvash ASSR, October 24, 1990, the Yamalonenets Autonomous Okrug, October 17, 1990, the Gorno-Altai Autonomous Oblast, October 25, 1990, and the Chechen-Ingush ASSR, November 27, 1990. In various autonomous republics, sovereignty was understood in similar terms. Declarations of independence were made, sometimes cautiously within the RSFSR, along with discussions about the possibility of conducting independent foreign policy, controlling resources, establishing their own monetary systems, and more. Separatism, from Chechnya to Tatarstan. The situation escalated to outright separatism. In the Chechen-Ingush ASSR, the Chechen National Congress, CNC, convened in November 1990, setting a course for Chechnya's secession from Russia. On May 25, 1991, its leader Jokhar Dudayev declared that the CNC was the only legitimate authority in Chechnya and that it was ready to take power. On June 8, 1991, the CNC declared itself the All-National Congress of the Chechen People, ANCCP. The session decided to depose the Supreme Soviet of Chechen-Ingushetia and proclaimed the Chechen Republic. On September 15, Ruslan Khasbolatov, the acting chairman of the RSFSR Supreme Soviet, dissolved the Supreme Soviet of Chechen-Ingushetia, making it easier for the separatists to seize power. Relying on the radical nationalists from the ANCCP, Dudayev held presidential elections on October 27, 1991, and was declared the democratically elected president of the Chechen Republic. During October and November 1991, Dudayev and his supporters took power, and the temporary bodies of the Republic formed by Khasbolatov were dissolved. On November 8, 1991, the president of the RSFSR issued a decree imposing a state of emergency in Chechen-Ingushetia. However, this only worsened the situation, as all political forces in Chechnya, seeing this as Moscow's attempt to destroy Chechen independence, rallied around the ANCCP, and opposition to Dudayev ceased to exist. On March 12, 1992, the Chechen parliament adopted a constitution for the Chechen Republic, which no longer mentioned any ties to Russia, declaring Chechnya an independent state. Another center of separatism was forming around the same time in Tatarstan, the Tatar ASSR within the RSFSR. By the end of the USSR, the situation in this republic differed significantly from that in Chechnya. Tatarstan was much more urbanized, with Russians making up 43.3% of the population in 1989, compared to 48.5% Tatars. Thus, the most responsive audience for nationalists could only be found in the Tatar countryside. The struggle for sovereignty in the early 1990s was led by a paradoxical alliance of the humanitarian intelligentsia, peasants, and the nomenklatura. The intelligentsia provided the slogans. Initially, the discussion centered on raising Tatarstan's status from an autonomous republic to a union republic. Later, there was talk of independent participation, not as part of the RSFSR, in signing a new union treaty, and finally, full state independence. The rural areas, where the Tatar language was preserved, provided the necessary mass support. The nomenklatura created the conditions for nationalist organizations and reaped the benefits of their struggle. This reliance on the Tatar countryside led to the Kazan Agricultural Institute becoming the main center of nationalist forces, where the first president of Tatarstan, Mintyamir Shamiev, and much of his entourage began their careers. Immediately after the adoption of the Declaration of Sovereignty, the Supreme Soviet of the Tatar ASSR announced that the republic would sign the Union Treaty independently, outside of the RSFSR delegation, followed by the conclusion of a bilateral treaty. When the RSFSR government was forced to start negotiations with the TASSR on this issue, the head of the delegation, RSFSR State Secretary Gennady Burbulis, acknowledged the legitimacy of Tatarstan's demand to elevate its legal status, effectively recognizing the independence of the autonomous republic at the state level. As a result of the negotiations, it was decided that the RSFSR authorities would proceed from recognizing the declaration of state sovereignty of Tatarstan and that relations between Russia and Tatarstan would henceforth be based on a bilateral treaty. However, the August 1991 coup soon occurred, and the issue of signing a new union treaty was no longer relevant. The issue of Tatarstan's independence was put on hold and remained in a state of uncertainty. In Kazan, they considered themselves an independent state, while in Moscow, they pretended that nothing had happened. This allowed the republic to receive generous subsidies from the federal center without escalating to a direct conflict with federal authorities. The conflict escalated on December 26, 1991, when the Supreme Soviet of the Republic of Tatarstan declared the entry of the Republic of Tatarstan into the Commonwealth of Independent States with the rights of a founding member of the CIS. Thus, Kazan asserted that Tatarstan should be regarded as a state equal in status to other CIS members, such as Ukraine or Belarus. This claim was reinforced by a referendum on March 21, 1992, regarding the status of the Republic of Tatarstan. Voters were asked, "Do you agree that the Republic of Tatarstan is a sovereign state, a subject of international law, building its relations with the Russian Federation and other republics, states on the basis of equal treaties?" Just over 61% of the votes were cast in favor. The referendum was not held without reason. In early 1992, Russia began preparing a federation treaty, which was supposed to become the foundation of Russia's constitutional law and determine the status of various territorial entities within the federation. The signing took place 10 days after the referendum in Tatarstan. Two republics did not sign the Federation Treaty, Chechnya, which explicitly declared its secession from the RSFSR, and Tatarstan. Although the latter did not directly declare independence, it acted like a sovereign state. The basis for refusing to sign the Federation Treaty was the declaration of state sovereignty of Tatarstan, which contradicted the Federation Treaty. On July 2, 1992, the Russian delegation at the negotiations proposed that Shamiev sign the Federation Treaty, at least in the sections of the document with which they agreed. This position was probably the limit to which the federal authorities were willing to go. Therefore, in Kazan, it was decided not to push the matter into serious conflict and to proceed with the signing of a bilateral treaty between Russia and Tatarstan. At a reception in the Kremlin on August 3, 1992, Burbulus stated, "Over the course of a year of negotiations with Tatarstan, we have changed significantly. We now believe that Russia should be an asymmetric federation with elements of a confederation." However, the negotiations again dragged on, and then the constitutional crisis of 1993 erupted, forcing the issue of relations with Tatarstan to be revisited later. Regions pull the blanket over themselves. In the early years of the Russian Federation's existence, attempts by national republics to define their sovereignty at the constitutional level were widespread. Article 61 of the Constitution of Tatarstan, 1992, defined the region as a sovereign state that establishes associated relations with the Russian Federation and positioned it as a subject of international law. Article 1 of the Constitution of the Republic of Tuva, 1993, while affirming the status of this Russian Federation subject as a sovereign state, recognized its right to self-determination and secession from the Russian Federation. Article 5 of the Constitution of Yakutia, 1992, declared that the land, subsoil, and their resources, waters, forests, flora and fauna, other natural resources, airspace, and continental shelf are the property of Yakutia. Article 9 contained the following wording: Yakutia is an independent participant in international and foreign economic relations. The Republic has the right to establish trade and other relations with other states, conclude international treaties, and participate in the activities of international organizations. Naturally, separatism could not help but impact the demographic composition of the national republics. In Tuva, the Russian population decreased from 32% in 1989 to 16.3% in 2010, in Chechnya, from 24.8% in 1989 to 1.92% in 2010, in Yakutia, from 50.3% in 1989 to 36.9% in 2010, and in Kalmykia, from 37.7% in 1989 to 29.6% in 2010. In most constitutions and several charters of the subjects of the Russian Federation, Bashkortostan, Buryatia, Ingushetia, Kalmykia, Karelia, Komi, North Ossetia, and others, the heads of the subjects were granted the authority to impose a state of emergency within their territories. According to the Russian Ministry of Justice, in 1999, the ratio of normative legal acts of the Federation's subjects that were inconsistent with federal legislation to those that were consistent was 1:3. The bloody consequences of separatism. Chechnya remained the most significant problem. Its authorities stubbornly pursued an independent policy, refused to recognize Russian laws, and the Republic's territory turned into a criminal enclave. At that time, Chechnya became the center for the production of counterfeit payment documents, aviso, through which funds from the Central Bank of the Russian Federation were laundered and embezzled. Chechen ethnic criminal gangs operated throughout Russia, taking control of various businesses and forcing them to pay tribute. Kidnapping people and forcing them to work in underground factories in Chechnya became a regular practice. Under these circumstances, Moscow decided not to delay addressing the Chechen issue any longer. On December 1, 1994, the Russian authorities issued an ultimatum to Jokhar Dudayev, demanding that all illegal armed groups voluntarily disarm by December 15. Dudayev refused, and on December 10, the First Chechen War began. Unfortunately, the federal forces were unable to quickly defeat the terrorist separatists. The fighting dragged on until 1996. The city of Grozny was captured by February 23, 1995. However, the militants retreated to the mountains, managed to regroup, replenish their losses, and then switched to a strategy of terror, taking hostages. After terrorist attacks on Budyanovsk and Kizlyar, as well as militant attacks on Grozny and renewed fighting near Shily and Videno, the federal authorities decided to enter into negotiations. On March 31, 1996, Yeltsin announced the cessation of hostilities in Chechnya and unveiled a plan for a peaceful resolution of the Chechen issue. The plan included a phased withdrawal of federal troops from Chechnya, the preparation and holding of free elections for the Republic's parliament, the signing of a treaty with Chechnya on the distribution of powers between the Republican and federal authorities, amnesty for participants in the hostilities, except for those who had committed serious crimes, and financial assistance for the restoration of Chechnya as the situation stabilized. On August 31, 1996, the Ksav-Yurt peace agreement was signed, under which federal troops were withdrawn from Chechnya, and a moratorium was declared on determining Chechnya's status for the next 5 years. The war ended, but peace never truly came. This issue would resurface on the federal agenda in 1999. The 1993 constitutional crisis, the shelling of the White House. As shock economic reforms and preparations for constitutional reform were underway, tensions began to escalate between the President of the Russian Federation and the Supreme Soviet. Under the still valid Soviet constitution, the powers of the Supreme Soviet were quite extensive, and deputies decided to intervene in the activities of the executive branch. In response, on March 20, 1993, Yeltsin announced the introduction of a special order of governance. It was stated that the 8th Congress of People's Deputies had taken no steps to overcome the crisis, and as a result, the constitution of the Russian Federation was being suspended. Constitutional guarantees would be ensured by the President, and both the Congress and the Supreme Soviet would cease their activities until a new constitution was adopted and new elections held. On March 23, the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation ruled that the President's actions were a violation of the Constitution. The 9th Extraordinary Congress of People's Deputies convened on March 26 and attempted to remove President Yeltsin from office, but the necessary number of votes was not secured. On April 25, a referendum was held in which the majority of voters supported the adoption of a new constitution and the re-election of Parliament. On April 30, the President's draft of the Constitution was published, and on June 5, the Constitutional Assembly began its work. The Supreme Soviet, effectively excluded from the process of constitutional reform, took an oppositional stance against the President. The confrontation reached a critical point on September 21, following the signing of the presidential decree on the phased constitutional reform in the Russian Federation. The decree accused the Supreme Soviet of sabotaging constitutional reform, and consequently, its activities were terminated. Since, under the then current constitution of the Russian Federation, the President did not have the authority to dissolve Parliament, the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation declared the President's actions unconstitutional. On September 24, the Supreme Soviet, relying on this decision, suspended Yeltsin's powers and transferred authority in the country to Vice President Alexander Ruskoy. The constitutional crisis reached its peak. On October 3, supporters of Parliament seized the Moscow mayor's office and attempted to storm the Ostankino television center. On October 4, troops were ordered into the capital by Yeltsin. Tanks fired on the Supreme Soviet building, which was then stormed and seized by the military. The leaders of the Supreme Soviet were arrested, including the head of the Supreme Soviet, Ruslan Kosbolotov, his first deputy Yuri Voronin, Vice President Alexander Ruskoy, and General Vladislav Akolov, who had been appointed Minister of Defense by Ruskoy, among others. The constitutional crisis ended in Yeltsin's victory. On December 12, a vote was held on the adoption of the new constitution, in which the majority, 58%, supported the constitutional reform. As a result of the adoption of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, a legal framework was established for delineating the areas of jurisdiction between the Russian Federation and its subjects based on agreements. The seemingly insurmountable Tatarstan problem was resolved. After prolonged negotiations, confrontations, and efforts to find compromise solutions, on February 15, 1994, the Treaty on the Delimitation of Jurisdictional Subjects and Mutual Delegation of Powers between the state authorities of the Russian Federation and the state authorities of the Republic of Tatarstan was signed. This treaty defined the exclusive jurisdiction and powers of Tatarstan, granting the Republic, for instance, the ability to utilize its natural resources. By the summer of 1999, 46 bilateral treaties and around 250 agreements had been signed, dividing the subjects of the Russian Federation into several categories. For some, the legal foundation consisted not only of the Russian constitution and federal laws but also of bilateral treaties. Others continued to build their relations with federal authorities in accordance with the Russian constitution and federal laws. As a result, significant differences arose in the status and powers of these subjects. Formation of an asymmetric federation. The desire to move away from federal asymmetry was clearly demonstrated in the history of the Ural Republic. On April 25, 1993, a regional referendum was held by decision of the Sverdlovsk Oblast Council on expanding the powers of the Sverdlovsk Oblast in the socio-economic sphere to the level of a republic within the Russian Federation. A total of 83.4% of voters supported the initiative. On July 1, the Sverdlovsk Oblast Council decided to proclaim the Ural Republic and began drafting its constitution, which was adopted by the Oblast Council on September 27. However, on November 9, the President of the Russian Federation signed Decree No. 1874, dissolving the Sverdlovsk Oblast Council, and on November 10, Decree No. 1890 was signed, removing Eduard Rossel, the head of the Ural Republic, from his position. All decisions regarding the Ural Republic were declared legally void. The asymmetric nature of the federation that emerged in the early 1990s is believed by researchers to be a consequence of the extreme weakness of the central government in Russia during this era. The model, in which the subjects of the federation possessed different rights, was ultimately accepted under the pressure of the national republics. Restoration of state unity. In 1999, President Yeltsin's approval rating plummeted to a level comparable with the margin of error. By December 1999, only 3% of Russian citizens trusted the president, according to data from FOM. On August 7, following the invasion of Dagestan by Chechen militants, the Second Chechen War began. In this situation, a new figure, unassociated with the failures of the past years, was needed to maintain control over the country. On August 9, Vladimir Putin, the director of the FSB, was appointed chairman of the Russian government. In September, decisive actions were taken against terrorists in Chechnya and Dagestan, leading to a rapid increase in Putin's popularity. On December 31, Yeltsin announced his early resignation, and the prime minister assumed the role of acting president. In the presidential election on March 26, 2000, Putin won in the first round with 51.95% of the vote. This victory was perceived in Russia as a sign of widespread trust in the young, energetic, and patriotic leader. The plan for change was outlined by Putin in his programmatic article Russia at the Turn of the Millennium. In it, Putin stated, "In our country, the state, its institutions and structures have always played an exceptionally important role in the life of the country and its people. A strong state is not an anomaly for Russians, not something to be fought against, but on the contrary, a source and guarantor of order, the initiator and main driving force behind any change." Soon, the first successes in restoring constitutional order were achieved in Chechnya, where by April 2000, most of the territory had been liberated from terrorists. On May 13, 2000, by presidential decree, special administrative territorial units, federal districts, were created. These are not subjects of the Federation but include several such subjects. Each district is headed by a presidential envoy, an official responsible for ensuring the implementation of the president's powers in their respective district. The central government's authority was significantly strengthened. The creation of macro-regions initially aimed to ensure political control, but over time, economic development programs for the territories began to be developed at the federal district level. The effectiveness of the new system was soon evident, as it introduced an institution that supervised the activities of regional authorities and had direct communication with the President of the Russian Federation. Interestingly, this reform drew on the administrative experience of the Russian Empire, where similar structures, such as general governorships, successfully combined several provinces into macro-regions. The next step was the reform of the Federation Council, the upper house of the Federal Assembly of the Russian Federation. Previously, senators were the presidents and governors of regions and the heads of legislative bodies of the federation's subjects by virtue of their positions. However, beginning January 1, 2002, senators were appointed by each federation subject, one by the head of the subject and the other by the regional parliament. This measure reduced the influence of regional leaders at the federal level, positively impacting the consolidation of state unity. Previously, many regional leaders, especially those of national republics, viewed themselves as figures of at least federal, if not international, significance. A significant step demonstrating that even Chechnya was now ready to live peacefully within the Federation was the referendum on unity with Russia and the adoption of the Constitution of the Chechen Republic, held on March 23, 2003. An overwhelming 95.9% of voters supported this initiative. The people of Chechnya made a definitive choice in favor of peace and reconciliation. Regional consolidation. The next step in strengthening the state was the consolidation of the Federation's subjects. The 1993 Russian constitution reflected the highest possible level of demands from national and regional elites in a context of central government weakness. It solidified a heterogeneous federation, where the phenomenon of complexly composed subjects emerged, where one subject was effectively nested within another. The large number of subjects, their de facto inequality, and the economic insolvency of many necessitated changes in the composition of Russia's regions, favoring their consolidation. On December 7, 2003, a referendum was held on the initiative of the authorities in Perm Oblast and the Komi-Permyak Autonomous Okrug regarding the merger of these regions. The initiative was supported by 83.9% of the oblast's residents and 89.7% of the Autonomous Okrug's residents. Notably, the national subject of the Federation cast an even higher percentage of votes in favor. On December 1, 2005, the Perm Krai emerged as a new subject of the Russian Federation, with the Komi-Permyak Okrug as a distinct administrative territorial unit within it. The first experience of consolidation proved effective, leading to the 2005 merger of Krasnoyarsk Krai with the Taimyr, Dolgonets, and even Autonomous Okrugs, which had been part of its composition. That same year, Kamchatka Oblast and the Koryak Autonomous Okrug united to form Kamchatka Krai. In 2006, a referendum led to the merger of Irkutsk Oblast and the USD Orda Buryat Autonomous Okrug. On March 1, 2008, the Chita Oblast and Ajan Buryat Autonomous Okrug merged to form Zabakalsky Krai. Potential regional mergers continue to be considered to this day. Abolition of gubernatorial elections. Despite the establishment of peace in Chechnya, terrorists continued to carry out attacks against civilians. On September 1, 2004, terrorists took hostages at a school in the town of Beslan in North Ossetia. The attack resulted in the deaths of 333 people, including 186 children. On September 13, 2004, during an expanded government meeting attended by regional leaders, the President emphasized the need to strengthen the vertical power structure to combat terrorism and proposed transitioning from direct gubernatorial elections to their approval by regional legislative assemblies based on nominations by the President of the Russian Federation. On December 11, 2004, Putin signed amendments to the federal law on the general principles of the organization of legislative and executive bodies of state power in the subjects of the Russian Federation, introducing a new procedure for appointing governors. Under this system, the regional head was approved by the local legislative body based on the president's nomination. The head of state also acquired the right to remove governors from office due to the loss of the president's trust, for improper performance of their duties, as well as in other cases provided for by federal law. Having played its role in strengthening the state, the practice of appointing heads of Federation subjects was abolished on June 1, 2012. Regions were granted the right to decide independently how to elect their leaders, either through general elections or by voting within the local parliament. As a result, direct elections for regional heads are now practiced in most regions, while in a few subjects, leaders are chosen by local parliaments. Bringing regional legislation in line with the Constitution. One of the challenges faced by the federal center in the 2000s was the legacy of the previous decade, the turbulent 90s, marked by numerous instances where regional legislation did not comply with federal law and even the constitution of the Russian Federation. As researchers noted, regional lawmaking in Russia during the 1990s inevitably reflected the existing centrifugal tendencies, manifesting as legislative separatism. It was not without reason that Putin wrote in his programmatic article, "Currently, there are over 1,000 federal legislative acts in Russia and several thousand laws from the republics, krays, oblasts, and autonomous okrugs. Not all of them meet the criteria mentioned above. If the Ministry of Justice, the Prosecutor's Office, and the Judiciary continue to address this issue as sluggishly as they have so far, the mass of dubious or outright unconstitutional laws could become critical in a legal and political sense. The constitutional security of the state, the very viability of the federal center, and the governance of the country and the integrity of Russia may be called into question. The continued disregard for discrepancies between legal norms undermined the very foundation of the state. Therefore, in the first decade of the 21st century, the federal authorities undertook extensive work to ensure the unity of Russia's legal space. Principles governing the legal activities of the Federation's subjects were established. The obligation of leaders and other officials of the Federation's subjects, representing both executive and legislative bodies, to comply with the requirements of the federal constitution and federal laws is crucial. Therefore, the possibility of applying measures of accountability to them, up to and including removal from office, is one of the most important tools for ensuring that the decisions of the authorities and administrations of the Federation's subjects comply with federal legislation. In 2020, amendments to the Constitution were adopted, resulting in a sweeping constitutional reform. The concept of public authority was introduced in the Russian Federation, combining state power with local self-government. The reform granted regional authorities the right to participate in the formation of local self-government bodies, as well as in the appointment and removal of local government officials. New administrative territorial units, known as federal territories, were also established. The constitutional reform addressed most of the contradictions related to the remnants of regional separatism that had persisted since the 1990s. However, the process of legal unification continued until the very recent past. The greatest challenges arose from resistance in several national republics. The most prolonged dispute concerned the right of the head of Tatarstan to hold the title of president, which was resolved only at the end of 2021. Yet, even long before this, in the 2000s, liberals who were critical of Putin's reforms acknowledged that the fractured and weak center of the 1990s had been replaced by a center capable of compelling the regions to adhere to the rules of the game it established. Putin's reforms, aimed at strengthening statehood and eliminating the state of semi-collapse in which Russia found itself during the 1990s, were a complete success.